Helen Keller. Chapter 2. The Dark Silence. The doctor looked at Helen. He shook his head. "There's nothing I can do," he said. But Helen's father and mother refused to give up hope so easily. Tuscumbia, Alabama was a very small town, and this was the only doctor there, so they took Helen to other doctors in other bigger towns. But the answer was always the same: no hope. Finally, the Kellers understood that Helen would live all her life alone in dark silence. She could not see the brightest light. She could not hear the loudest noise. Soon she forgot the words she had been learning. Then she became dumb. She could not speak at all. Helen's body continued to grow, but how could her mind grow in the dark silence? There was so much she could no longer understand. She cried, but she didn't know she was sad. She screamed and kicked, but she didn't know she was angry. She smiled very seldom. She never laughed at all. She wanted people to understand her, but she could not talk to them. She didn't know any words. Helen didn't even know her own name. So now Helen began to make signs. A nod meant yes. A shake of the head meant no. A pull meant come. A push meant go away. When Helen wanted something big, she spread her hands wide, as if she was holding a big ball. When she wanted something small, she took a tiny pinch of skin between two fingers. When Helen wanted her mother, she patted her own cheek and made a soft mewing sound. Helen's father wore glasses. Helen liked to feel them, to take them off and put them on her father's nose. When she wanted her father, she pretended to put on a pair of glasses too. Soon Helen had 60 signs to tell people what she wanted. Helen tried to find out about the world by touching everything she could. The Kellers lived on a small farm. Helen loved to pat the horses and cows. Here's a picture. Her mother taught her how to feed the chickens. Some grew so tame they ate right out of her hand. Then Helen would run her hands over their plump, warm bodies. She liked to touch anything that moved, but there was so much she could not really understand. Helen put her fingers on her father's face and hands. She felt him holding a book. So Helen too held up a book in front of her face, but she didn't know what books were for. She felt her mother pulling up weeds in the garden, so Helen tried to pull them up too. But how could she know the difference between a weed and a flower? Worst of all were lips. Again and again, Helen felt other people's lips moving, so she moved her lips too. But she didn't know what the moving lips meant. What was everyone doing? What was going on? Helen became more and more angry. Sometimes the feeling of anger was more than she could stand. Then she kicked and screamed and tried to smash everything she touched. But this didn't help either. Helen grew even more angry. Soon not a day passed without a terrible temper tantrum. There was so much she could not know. One day Helen spilled some water on her own apron. She took it off and laid it down in front of the fireplace. But it didn't dry fast enough to please her. She moved it closer and closer. Finally, she laid the apron right on top of the flames. The flames shot up through the apron, then to Helen's dress. Fire! She was on fire! Helen screamed. Luckily, someone was in the next room. The fire was put out before it did any harm. But she could have been killed, Mrs. Keller said. Or she could have burned the whole house down, Helen's father answered, and us with it. How much longer could this go on? When Helen was 5 years old, her sister Mildred was born. All Helen knew about this baby was that it took up too much of her mother's time that up until now had belonged to her. Too often when Helen wanted to run into her mother's arms, she found that the baby was already there. One day Helen reached out for her doll's cradle and found the baby inside. This was too much. Helen growled like an animal. Then she reached out and knocked the cradle over. The baby fell screaming to the floor. Luckily, Mildred wasn't hurt. But what about next time? Helen was growing bigger and wilder every day. Next time, she might really hurt the baby, or worse, Helen's father said. No, I'm afraid there's only one thing we can do. We will have to send Helen away. Send her away? Mrs. Keller cried. Where would we send her? But she knew the answer herself. There was only one place that would take a wild creature like Helen: the State Insane Asylum. Let's wait just a little bit longer, Mrs. Keller begged. Mr. Keller nodded, but they both knew that this was no real answer. They both knew that sooner or later Helen would have to be sent away. Then, one day, Mrs. Keller read about a special school in Boston, Massachusetts, called Perkins Institute. Perkins was a school for the blind. But once, long ago, the teachers there had taught a little girl who was both blind and deaf. Somehow they had worked out a way to make her understand the outside world. Write to them, Mrs. Keller begged her husband. Maybe they can help Helen too. Helen's father shook his head. He had almost run out of hope, but that night he sat down and wrote a letter to the Perkins Institute. Now there was nothing else to do but wait. The end.